Well, do turn back to that passage in Ruth, if you can do. If you've got one of the church Bibles just in the seats in front of you, you'll find it on page 267. It's great to be starting this new series this morning for the next 4 weeks in the book of Ruth. It's an absolute gem of a book. Maybe even this afternoon you'd like to go away and read it in one sitting. It'll take you about 15 minutes to do so, and I'm sure you'll be blessed. You'll be blessed, even though it is a story of brokenness, of sadness in parts, but also a story of romance and God at work behind the scenes in ways that the characters could not imagine. But it's also a book that raises questions. Incredibly relevant questions to us. Questions like, is God good? Is God working through normal people? Not just kings and prophets and priests, but people like me. Is he at work when it seems that nothing appears to be happening? When life is just mundane, when you're trudging through one circumstance to the next, or perhaps even going from one tragedy to the next. It also raises the question, is it possible to be godly at a time when people are not? When everybody else is doing what they see fit in their own eyes? Well, those questions are just really the tip of the iceberg of what Ruth throws up, of what we'll see in this book. And one of the things I love about this book is that those questions aren't answered by pat answers. Have you ever experienced that? You've got a big question. It's coming from the depths of your heart, and somebody just gives you what seems to be a very superficial answer. That's not what you will find in the book of Ruth. So come with me, turn to it, like I said, page 267, if you're in one of the church Bibles, and let's turn to chapter 1. There's 3 scenes that I want you to see as we walk through this passage together this morning. The first one I've called the downward spiral. See, as the book begins, things start badly and they quickly get worse for Ruth and for her family. Just look down to verse 1. We're told that this book takes place in the days when the judges ruled. Now, this was a period between the death of Joshua, and it was when these judges ruled. Between the time of Joshua and Samuel. It spanned a few hundred years. And if you cast your eyes back to the last verse of Judges, it says those words, "In those days Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit." In other words, everybody did what they wanted. They were all out for themselves, whatever they could get. It was a time nationally of instability and immorality. That's the time that this book is set. It's not a good time. And then we'd see that there's actually a famine in the land. Now, when God made a covenant with his people, he explained to him that they would enter this wonderful land, a land that flowed with milk and honey. But he also said that for covenantal unfaithfulness, there would be curses. And that these curses would mean that they wouldn't enjoy the produce of the land. There would be famine. So we've got 2 indicators right in this first verse that things are not good nationally. God's people, Israel, were not walking with the Lord. And the result is that the fields were bare and the barns were empty. This is a real situation. People were struggling. They were suffering. And in that, God was saying to them, come back to me. Can you not see that the way that you're pursuing life is not working? Come back to me. Call upon my mercy and I will show you mercy. Call upon me for forgiveness and grace, and I'll restore all the things that have been taken away. Now that's the basic cycle in the book of Judges. That happens time and time again. Israel turns to other gods and sins. They're subjected to the other nations who cause all sorts of difficulties to them. Then they turn back to God and ask for help. And God mercifully raises up a judge, a deliverer, in order to save them. That's the cycle that we're going to be looking at in the book of Judges tonight. If you come along to the evening service, we're going to be doing an overview of that book. But back in Ruth, the camera angle, as it were, shifts from this national picture to this family. It zooms in on Naomi's family. How are they going to respond to this national context? Well, let's read again, starting at verse 1. Look down in your Bibles. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So instead of turning back to the Lord, this little family, they turn their backs on the Lord. They leave the land of promise and they go down 50 miles down the road to Moab. Now that might not seem like much to us, but for anyone back then reading this, that would be an ominous place to emigrate. And we've already seen that that is not God's holy land. In fact, it was a land of pagan worship. The worship there often involved sexual activity and prostitution. It was a place where people could sacrifice their children to their so-called gods. It was an evil place. It was also a place that had routinely fought against Israel. They were enemies of God's people. And you see then that this family are seeking to take provision into their own hands as they travel to Moab. Things are getting worse and worse for Elimelech and his family. That name, Elimelech, it means my God is king. It's ironic, isn't it? Because his life shows nothing of the sort. It shows that I can sort this out. That's a problem that lots of men have, isn't it? We think that we can be the problem solvers, and we don't entrust ourselves to God. That's what Elimelech did. Now, if you're a husband this morning, I want you to consider that. Are you leading your family to God or away from him? I don't, of course, mean where are you moving to? God's way of dealing with his people isn't geographically located in the new covenant like it was in the old. But are you walking with God yourself? And are you leading your family towards God? Are you doing an Elimelech? This is something you need to ask yourself. But for all of us, whether we're married or we're single, whether we're male or female, are we personally taking steps towards God? Are we joyfully following him? Or are we doing so reluctantly? Maybe taking strides away from what you know God wants for you. That was what Elimelech and Naomi did. And sadly, things continue to go wrong. We learn that when they're in Moab, Elimelech dies. Now just think what that meant for Naomi. She would have been devastated. And that would have been especially the case in a context when the husband exclusively provided for the family. But as if that's not bad enough, next we learn that the two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, take two Moabite women to be their wives. It was somewhat predictable, if they want to live in Moab, that might happen, even though the Old Testament continually teaches not to do that. But things continue to get worse. We then learn that after living in Moab for a decade, for 10 years, Mahlon and Chilion die. Now, just reverse a little bit. Did you notice earlier in the passage in verse 1, it said that they moved down to Moab for a while? Now, they didn't really move for a while if it turned out to be 10 years, did they? Now, there's a lesson there, isn't it, in the way that sin can grab us, can't it? They made a bad decision, and they remained in Moab for a very long time. They didn't pop down there to get food and then return. They built a family in Moab. They stayed there. They had a house. They brought up their children. And while they're there, heartbreak happens as these two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, die. Just imagine Naomi now stood by her third grave. Words cannot explain her loss. Just exhaustion from sorrow. Later in the passage, verse 21, Naomi describes herself as empty. Her name means pleasant, but nothing that has happened to her over these years has been pleasant. It's been absolutely devastating. If you've lost a spouse or somebody close to you, you know how dreadful that ordeal is. And we add to that the context at the time that women were absolutely dependent on men to protect and provide for them. Her husband, Elimelech, had taken her to Moab and is now dead. And then her sons, whose role it would have been to provide and protect, have died as well. Now, things could not be any more hopeless. Naomi has gone from living in Bethlehem, which means house of bread, by the way. She's gone from living in that land of promise and blessing, and now she's in a foreign land with no protection or provision. In those days, for a woman, I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but her whole function in life, in that cultural context, was to work with her husband and then have children so that her family line could continue. That was what society expected of someone back then, someone like Naomi. And of course, she'd done the hard work, hadn't she? She'd had the sleepless nights. She'd raised those boys. And now this has happened. As Naomi processed things at that time, two things would have utterly overwhelmed her. Now, one of them would be, how on earth am I going to eat? How am I going to put bread on the table? How am I going to make it through the day myself? And how will I even look after Ruth and Orpah? But also at the same time, maybe in the back of her mind or in the depths of her heart, would have been this sense of utter failure. That this function that she had in that society to continue the family line had just died in front of her. Now, I'm sure of those two, putting bread on the table was the pressing matter. It was the immediate concern of those two things. But in terms of the deep heartache, maybe it was the second. It's not hard to imagine her lying on her bed and wondering, why has this happened, Lord? How has it come to this? Where are you, Lord? Naomi is utterly broken. Utterly broken. Now, many of us will have mercifully been protected from things like this. But for some of you, I know that you have been through this sort of loss. Perhaps even at this moment, you feel you're right at the bottom, and that there doesn't seem to be light at the end of the tunnel. There doesn't seem to be hope for today or tomorrow. Now, there's a feeling that you're drowning in darkness, and God seems so far away. Now, as a church community, we need to be ready to walk with people when life hits like this. In times when there are no easy answers. Often that means sitting with people and weeping with them, with an arm around them. It means sticking with them, like we're going to see Ruth doing later in the chapter. Now, as we continue through this book, we're going to see that God is present, that God really is working behind the scenes, that his saving purposes are at work, even if they're hidden and in unexpected ways. And yet we've not got there yet, have we? And that's what life can be like. We don't always know what is happening or how it will end. Like Naomi, the best we can do is cling to God, even if it's with the tips of our fingers, waiting for the darkness to lift. That's what we see in the first scene, the downward spiral. But let's move to the second, which I've called the turning point. It's not dramatic, but after those 5 dreadful verses of this downward spiral, at least things stop getting worse. Now the tide begins to turn. And the first sign that we hear of this is, we read verse 6, that Naomi hears, perhaps from a passing trader or something like that things were getting better back home. Look down at verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Now, the first turning that we see in these verses is a geographic one. It's a physical turning. Naomi, she realizes that she needs to go home, that her prospects would be far better in Bethlehem. And so she packs up her suitcase, or whatever you packed it back in those days, and along with Ruth and Orpah, she sets off down the road. Now, I think this in itself is a sign of faith. How many in Naomi's circumstances would have completely turned their backs on God? They may have said, "Where is God? How could he have done this to me? How can he be a God of love and grace when this is happening? There's no way I'm going back there." But Naomi doesn't. In fact, she associates the news of food with God's provision. See, God is stirring faith in her, even if that's a weak faith. Even if it's from right at the bottom, when she's got nothing to give. God is preparing her, and he's opening her heart. He's inviting her back to enjoy his blessing. And because of that, we also see signs of a spiritual turning, not just a geographic one. Now, that word turn or return is actually littered throughout this passage. If you had a Hebrew Bible, you'd find that the same word was used 11 times in 12 verses. Just flick your eyes through it. The family, in the original, it would say they turn to Moab, verse 1. They return home and join the road to return home, verse 6 and 7. Naomi, her daughter-in-law, they turn back to Moab, verse 8. Ruth tells Naomi that she will turn to her people. And then again in verse 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16. And then again, verse 21, the Lord has brought me back. He's literally turned me back. And finally, verse 22, Naomi turned from Moab. 11 times in 22 verses. Now, the way to bore people in English is to continue to repeat yourself, isn't it? It's to use the same words again and again. If we've got any English teachers among us, they'd be saying, "Oh, you need to use a different adjective here, or a different noun, or a different verb," whatever it is. But that's not how it worked in Hebrew. The way that in Hebrew you highlighted something is to repeat yourself, especially in a narrative like this. And that's what we see again and again. It's being highlighted that this is a passage about turning. That's the main word used in the Old Testament for repentance and conversion. It's a story about turning, of converting, of returning to the Lord. Now, I want to ask you this morning, is that your story? Haven't all of us wandered from God? But the question is, have you returned to God? Have you turned back to him? Have you called out for deliverance and forgiveness from darkness? If you've not done that, I want to urge you to do that today. To do a Naomi. Do it even if God has brought you right to the bottom. Because God is saying to you in this passage, like he said to Naomi back then, "I am enough. I will provide for you if you will only acknowledge that I am God." Have you done that? Have you turned from false gods like there were in Moab? Have you turned and stopped depending on yourself to provide like Elimelech? Have you returned to God? Not to the land, of course, which was back then a symbol of God's presence. That's not what we need to do now. What we need to do is approach God through Jesus and say, I'm done with doing life on my own and I need you. I'm coming to you with the empty hands of faith. That's what Naomi does in this passage. But it's not just Naomi who turns. Come back to verse 8. Naomi tells these girls, the daughter-in-laws of hers, not to come with me. She says, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. And she blesses them. She says, may the Lord show kindness to them. She kisses them, and then she weeps, verse 9. If this was a movie, you'd be watching this scene, just wondering how it's going to end. First of all, Orpah goes back home. And you'd be wondering, she goes back home to Moab, and you'd be wondering, is Ruth going to do the same thing? But Ruth puts her foot down. She is convinced that the cost of following Naomi is not too high. Ruth is determined. She's insistent. Even though Naomi explains to her that the prospects of finding a husband in Judah are so small. Naomi knows, of course, what it's like to be a woman in a foreign land. She knows, or she thinks, that Ruth would be far better where she's come from. And yet Ruth insists. Ruth's having none of it. Look at this memorable reply, verse 16. She says, don't urge me to leave you or turn back. That's that word again, turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. And then the final sentence, when Naomi realizes that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Just imagine that scene of Naomi sort of repeatedly saying, go back, just go. But then Ruth, almost exasperated, saying, there's no way I'm going back. She says, listen, I'm staying with you. I'm committed to you. But also I'm committed to your God. I've converted. I may be a Moabite, but I'm trusting in Yahweh. I've been converted, I've turned, and the cost of following God is not too high for me. We'll go together. How do we know that that's the point that Ruth comes to? Well, she said, didn't she? Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Those words, they echo what God had said himself in his covenant to his people, where he said, I will be your God and you will be my people. Ruth knew that. She's identifying with the God of Naomi and with Naomi herself, God's people. She's saying, I'm in. 1 Thessalonians 1 verse 9 says that the people turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. That's what Ruth is doing here. She's turning from idols to the living God. And she does that without any reservation, without knowing how it's going to turn out when she goes to this land that she's never been to before. But she's committed to God and she's committed to his people. I think that's a sign of a true and healthy conversion. For some people, they find it easier to commit just to God. It's just them and him, Jesus and my Bible. They don't want to be part of the covenant community. like a church. For others, they love the sense of community. They want to be with God's people, but God, I'm not sure I can make that step. Now, the first is an anemic Christianity, wanting Christ without his church. The second is not Christianity at all. But can you see here, Ruth, she shows us a real, robust, committed faith in God and his purposes, which are, after all, to gather a people to himself. I pray that you have had that turning point in your life, but also that you would continue on that path. That today you would take that next step of faithfulness. Now, maybe that means trusting Jesus for the very first time, turning from your sin and embracing salvation and enjoying God's love. Now, maybe it means saying, I know I'm a believer, and I want to make that evident. I want to be baptized. I want to join the church. Now, a few people have talked to me about that in the past few months, and let me encourage you to come and speak to me again this morning or in the days that follow. Or maybe you've been a Christian for years and you've not yet formally become a member of this church, even though you see it as your home. Maybe you'll pick up a leaflet about church membership in the foyer, which we want to be meaningful. We want to walk with one another like we see Ruth here walking with Naomi through thick and thin of life. Don't we all, as followers of Christ, need people to draw alongside us, to strengthen us in our faith? And the best way of doing that is knowing who's in, who wants that. Who's part of this family? Who's saying, I want that for myself and I want to be that person for others? Now, there's so many other steps you could take of faith this morning, but those are just a few. What will it be for you? What is the next step of faith today? Please take that next step. But finally, let's just turn to this final section, the bitter homecoming. See, Naomi has escaped the downward spiral. She's turned back to God, and they come to Bethlehem, and the people remember her. But they say, can this be Naomi? Imagine returning to your hometown after 10 years, a little village somewhere, and everyone recognizes you. Perhaps you're a few years older. Perhaps the toll that Naomi had been through the past 10 years was very evident in her face. Presumably, as she came around the corner, there would have been this awkward pause and a realization that Elimelech wasn't with her, but instead Ruth, the Moabite. And then Naomi starts to share her heart. She explains, verse 21, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. And I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. I think this must have been such a hard day for Naomi. On the one hand, she's home. On the other hand, in this small town, everybody's looking at her. Everyone is asking questions. Everyone is talking about her. You see, verse 21, it says, the whole town was stirred. Quite possibly, she felt ashamed. She knew that the Lord was God, the Lord was Almighty, but I want to suggest that at this point of the story, she's not quite come to see, I'm not quite sure she knew that the Lord was good. She knew that the Lord was God, but not that the Lord was good. It's far from the homecoming she would have hoped for. Elimelech's not by her side. And yet just look how the author chooses to end this chapter. Now, it's a chapter that begins with famine. And look how it ends, verse 22. They are arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, the author's not just wanting to tell us the time of year, but hinting that there is hope. That Naomi and Ruth have not reached the end of the road. That their dreadful situation will turn a corner. That God is going to turn this physical famine and spiritual family, not just in this family, but for the whole nation, he's going to draw that to an end. He's going to bring a physical and a spiritual harvest that is going to outlive Naomi and Ruth. But they will see the start of that. But at this point in the story, Naomi doesn't know that, does she? She can't depend on those 3 men that were with her in Moab. She'll never forget the loss, and she doesn't know what will lie ahead for her and Ruth. Instead, she's bitter and empty. You ever felt like that? Just kind of like winded or paralyzed or unable to get out of bed in the morning? I don't think we're supposed to read this and think, Naomi should have known better. No, we're to read this and rejoice that God is at work in ways that she could never have known. And in a soft and gentle way, the message of this passage is that God continues to work in ways we do not understand from where we stand. But over the next few months, next few weeks, we'll be reminded again and again that God is good, that he is sovereign, that he's bringing about his plans. Not just for Ruth and Naomi, but for all of God's people, even us. That God is leading us home. That he will do it through a descendant of Ruth. And that there are some times when all we can do is just cling on to God and to those promises, knowing that one day we will be truly home and all bitterness will be taken away. Amen.